Thanks for joining us in Business as we feature people, ideas and companies that move financial markets. You're in business with me, Harsha Subramaniam. This is on top of our agenda. We talk economy with Dr. Subir Gokarn and the former CII President Gopalakrishnan. We put the spotlight on rising losses for oil marketing companies with P.K. Goyal, Director of Finance at Indian Oil Corporation.
We are in better health than many other countries of the world. Therefore, there is no reason for excessive or unwarranted pessimism. We expect that growth will pick up in Q2 to Q4.
I think we need stability in the foreign exchange market. We need stability in the price situation, and we also need growth. All of these are interrelated objectives, and all of these need to be pursued.
Those were voices from the government, hoping perhaps that some of the measures taken by the government is going to work. Joining us now to talk about the economy, Dr. Subir Gokarn, Director of Research at Brookings India and former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. Dr. Gokarn, many thanks for joining us on Bloomberg. Let me begin by asking you first about the food security bill that's been passed. This is coming at a time when India is facing large budget deficits. It's going to increase spending by nearly $20 billion in terms of subsidies. Do you think this is going to leave a larger fiscal hole? Can India afford this right now?
I think the issue is not whether this is the costs of the bill are just going to be added on to a business as usual fiscal scenario, but rather what sort of adjustments can you make in the overall fiscal scenario to accommodate this. Now this is a fait accompli. This has been passed, it's law, and obviously the government is obliged now to meet the obligations that it has made in terms of delivery. So there are two ways in which you can look at it. One is that it will take some time to reach the level at which these full fiscal implications play out, and that may give the government some time in terms of looking at other things to make adjustments to in order to accommodate this. The other is that there needs to be a sort of immediate planning and if you might say forecasting, to start anticipating the impact and also build up to the point where the overall fiscal targets, the overall fiscal objectives are met. Keep in mind that in a previous budget, I think it was the 2011 budget, if I'm not mistaken, maybe it was 2012, where the former Finance Minister, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, talked about bringing the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act version 2. It had sunsetted out in 2010. We are not on a fiscal rule right now. But if we bring that back, he did specifically mention that he would be looking at a rule that would cap subsidies. So if we work in that direction, if that's the way fiscal management is going to go, and I think that's a very good direction, then this has to be accommodated within the overall cap, which means you have to look for more revenues from somewhere else, or you have to find other places to cut expenditure. The implementation of GST, which is as of now on track for 2015, will, to my mind, increase revenue substantially. Now, of course, you could argue that those revenues are better spent on creating assets, and I think that's a legitimate argument. But basically, when you look at the overall fiscal balance, I think it's important not to focus exclusively on the food security bill. Let's look at the totality of the picture. Where can you streamline expenditure? Where can you raise revenues, and then make an overall assessment of the impact.
Point taken, Dr. Gokarn. The other point I want to talk to you about is about the rupee. We have seen the rupee fall consistently despite the measures taken by the Reserve Bank of India and the government. Do you think the objective, or rather the strategy employed by the RBI and the government, do you think it is in the right direction? Do you see this working?
I think it's difficult to separate out in this short period of time the impact of what one might call fundamental or trend factors and the impact of what these measures were supposed to address, which was essentially the speculative pressure. So if you were to ask the question, suppose these measures had not been taken, where would the rupee have been? And if the answer to that is rupee would have been even more depreciated, then you could argue that these measures have had an impact. If on the other hand you would argue that it would have made no difference, then obviously the assessment is, well, why go through these measures in the first place? I can't answer that question, it's difficult. I think we've got to look at the short term and the long term context in which the rupee is behaving as it is. In the short term, as the news story just before I came on indicated, many emerging economies are going through this problem. It's not just an India-specific problem. There is general capital movement volatility across the world, and currencies are getting hit. The dollar is appreciating across everything. So there is obviously, to some extent at least, global pressure on the rupee, which is not something that we can control through our measures. Then let's focus on the domestic. I think the short-term measures as have been implemented over the last 4 weeks or so are addressing a very specific source of pressure on the rupee, which is what was referred to as speculative pressure. Now, whether that was very large or not, I think that's a judgment that the policymakers needed to make, and they did make it. But there's also a fundamental issue, which is the current account deficit, and we've been talking about this for a long time. A number of new forces on the current account over the last year or two, which have taken it to such high levels, and are putting essentially very persistent pressure on the rupee. So when we look ahead, we've got to break this up into two components. One is, how do we ride out the short term? Second is, how do we make the corrections necessary internally to make sure that this impact does not persist? And that means, I think, focusing very, very intensely on reducing the current account deficit. That has to be the number one element in any strategy to buffer ourselves against prolonged impact of
the underlying growth, which by whatever estimates is looking bleak, and more importantly, you're not seeing any revival or any evidence of revival of the capital investment cycle. What do you think needs to be done for revival to take place and for perhaps growth to push forward, at least in the next fiscal?
Well, I think when the measures of July 15th were taken, it reflected obviously a tactical choice, at least, to switch focus from growth to exchange rate management. In the process, because it required liquidity tightening, the impact on interest rates was obviously anti-growth. The impact is essentially to reduce the incentive that banks have to continue to provide credit. So this is a trade-off that was made, recognizing that in order to achieve the objective of stabilizing the rupee, of course we already, there's a debate on whether that's happened or not, but that's a separate question. And in the process, you might actually end up sacrificing little growth. So exchange rate stability versus growth was the trade-off. Now that trade-off is in play now. So to the extent that these policy responses are anti-growth or going to slow down growth, one would expect that there would be any momentum in the growth process or any regaining of momentum in the growth process. That's not logical. But there are two things I think we have to keep in mind. One is, how do we handle the rupee issue, because that directly impacts growth, and there I think the issue of containing the current account deficit is not going to happen overnight. I mean, nobody is expecting realistically that these are things that can be done in a day and the impacts will start being felt in a month. These are long-term structural issues that we're talking about.
Sure.
But when you start correcting them, I think you set in motion a series of positive forces which will help to contribute to growth. And here I think two issues that I want to highlight. One is by gaining control of the currency, you are allowing monetary policy to push back to the growth inflation balance. And there I think as inflation starts to stabilize, starts to moderate, you do have the opportunity to use interest rates to stimulate growth. On the other side, I think it's an issue of getting the investments back, and we are seeing some signs of the Cabinet Committee on Investment starting to push through on some large projects. I hope that materializes. I hope that starts to translate into money spent on the ground. That's one way, that's one factor that will help to contribute. But these are all part of a package which involve the rupee, growth and inflation. You cannot separate them. I don't think you can have policies that focus on one without really considering all of the other factors.
I have one last question, Dr. Gokarn. We're going to have a new man in charge at Reserve Bank of India. Do you think, will there be a change in priorities for the RBI as the new governor takes over? Growth, inflation, rupee that you mentioned, will growth feature higher on his agenda?
Well, if you go by Dr. Rajan's public positions on the issue of growth versus inflation, whatever I've read and I've heard, basically suggests that he does consider inflation in a sort of sense of principle or strategy, does consider inflation to be the dominant objective of the central bank. And he's often talked about low and stable inflation being the primary objective of the central bank. I don't see that this is going to be very different from the position that the Reserve Bank has taken under Dr. Subir. So I think the expectation that this will mean a dramatic 180-degree shift away from inflation to growth, at least from what I know of Dr. Rajan's public positions, I don't really see that as a possibility.
Dr. Gokarn, many thanks for joining us with your perspective. Appreciate your time for us. That was Dr. Subir Gokarn, former Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India and Director at Brookings Institution at India.